right, we're back. Let's talk about some skills that could be considered traits. So, first off, there's intelligence. Now, how would a skill like intelligence be considered a trait? Well, the idea is that it's that people vary on this particular skill, and it should be measurable, right? And that's really the criterion for being a trait. The other skill is related, but it's different, and that's social emotional intelligence. So under intelligence would be included, vocabulary, math skills, spatial reasoning. Social emotional intelligence would be, really a set of specific social and emotional abilities that allow us to deal really effectively with ourselves and then also with other people. So we're going to have to explain this a little bit, aren't we? So on the side of intelligence are a lot of academic tests, right? Where you have some math problems to solve or some words to define or show that you understand. With the spatial reasoning, maybe you're going to be asked to put a puzzle together, or you're going to be asked to say which shape comes next in this sequence, these kinds of things. With the social emotional intelligence, we're going to look for evidence that the person is aware of their own emotional states, that they recognize the times that this is what it feels like when I'm sad or that I'm angry, that they have strategies for soothing themselves when they get really upset, and then also that they can recognize other people's emotions, and that they know how to sort of manage other people's emotions, help them to calm down when they're upset, how to pump them up when they're feeling low energy and things like that. So these are different skills that have to do with sort of understanding something. In the case of intelligence, it's all these sort of academic things. And in the case of social and emotional, it's these inter and intrapersonal things. So when we talk about the trait and skill approach, some of the advantages to looking at these things through the lens of us having traits, as opposed to sort of the previous theories where it's just sort of like this one large personality, right? One of the advantages is that it simplifies personality into these basic dimensions that now we can get really concrete and talk about, right? When you talk about Freudian theory, a lot of times you're saying things about, this unconscious dynamic among the three aspects, the ego and superego, and all. It's very vague and imprecise. The trait theory, by breaking things down into, basic dimensions, really simplifies what we're talking about, makes it a lot more concrete. The reliance on deeper consistency gives us this explanation for why behaviors would be consistent, right? We've got these deep underlying traits that are going to reveal themselves to some degree across situations and also across time, so that we can expect to see certain kinds of behaviors out of this particular individual because they're holding these traits. You'll notice that the trait and skill approach, these are the first theories that really include clear-cut scales for assessing the very thing that their theory is based on, right? We have actual scales for assessing these traits. And being based on factor analytical processes means that it's not just us trying to fit behavior to a theory. Instead, now we have the behavior driving the theory. And that's been really helpful for psychology since trait theory came along. The idea that we could be talking about something that we know for sure must exist because, we can measure it. Trait and skill approach allows us to compare between people, which is really the function of personality theory, right? To find out, how people vary and why we aren't all just exactly the same and stuff like that. So we can make comparisons between individuals. This has been really advantageous for, like I mentioned before, business, who, a lot of these companies are, and different kinds of organizations, the military being a really common one, will administer personality tests or skill tests, intelligence tests being really common, so that they can objectively determine who would be a best match for the job that's available or for the kind of training that's available and stuff like that. It's been a really big benefit for us to be able to do objective assessments rather than just relying on whether there's like a good fit between the manager and the candidate, right? Like that can be very subjective. So these objective measures have been really nice. Like less discrimination is what I mean by that. Some of the limits to this approach, it can be oversimplified, right? We're simplifying it down to basic dimensions. And maybe, like I said, with the big five, maybe there's more than 5 traits, right? Certainly, maybe there's more than the 3 traits that Eysenck said. And really, honestly, Eysenck said there's really just 2 traits. Maybe we've simplified it too much and we're missing all sorts of richness in personality if we just focus on these traits. Of course, if we administer scores, tests to people and they produce a score, once we see that score, that's going to be the filter for all other behaviors that come after that. All their behaviors are going to be seen as consistent with the label that we have based on the score that they produced. So I'll give an example. I know someone who he really thinks that he thinks that the spectrum of agreeableness on the Big 5 inventory is from agreeable to disagreeable, but that's not true. It's agreeable to skeptical. And so he sees himself as disagreeable because he asks a lot of questions. He's kind of a contrarian, stuff like that. But actually, he's really high on agreeableness. He goes along with a lot of things. He gets taken advantage of a lot of the times because he's not skeptical enough. But now that I've identified that, because we've had a conversation because he's really interested in these kinds of things, but it kind of from a more philosophical perspective. And so now that I've kind of recognized the agreeableness component in this person, I kind of a lot of behaviors that are emitted that probably have nothing to do with agreeableness. I still see it through that lens because now I've got my label. I'm like, oh, I've got a label for this person. And now everything they do looks to me like evidence of agreeableness. And that's really a risk. And in psychology in general, we have that problem. Once you have a diagnosis for somebody, everything they do looks like, see, further evidence of the diagnosis, right? And that's a problem whenever we're talking about psychological factors. And then the final limit, I tried to make everything, sort of showing you that it kind of is tilting towards advantages, but really it's kind of balanced as far as problems with the trait and skill approach. This approach in general underestimates how much variability a person displays across situations. I mean, there are times that a very outgoing and very, extroverted person will look introverted because they haven't spoken in, like, let's say an hour. They don't seem to be doing anything that would be illustrative of extroversion at all. And so we might say, oh, so this person is clearly introverted. And the reason why they're acting like that is because they're sitting in class listening to a lecture or something, right? And it's like social context demands that I sit here quietly. So variability across situations, if we focus too much on traits, we make it seem like the person almost has to act in certain ways and is like ignorant or immune to the pressures of the context, right? And context is going to have a big impact on everybody's behavior. Most of the time, there are certain circumstances where a person will be just completely tone deaf and behave in a way that the context doesn't value, but most of the time people are more flexible than that. It also underestimates any kind of unconscious motives. In fact, the trait and skill approach doesn't really even talk about unconscious in any way. The closest we get to talking about something that could be construed as unconscious would be Eysenck talking about, your reticular formation being the source of how alert or reactive you are, stuff like that, because that's brainstem where you're not really thinking, you're just, sort of reacting. So I guess that's a little unconscious, but Eysenck never used the term unconscious, never made it seem like there was some kind of conflict going on under the surface or anything like that. And then the other thing that the trait approach really underestimates is how much early experience can shape the expressions of our personality, our traits. My best example of how much experience, especially early experience, can modify the expression of our traits would be to give you 2 different sayings from 2 different cultures that give completely opposite advice. Here in the U.S., there's a phrase that says, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And that statement is encouraging a person, if they want something, to say something. Stand up for yourself, be assertive, right? If you don't say anything, nobody else is going to do it for you. In Japan, they have a phrase that says, the nail that sticks up will be pounded down. So what they're saying is that if you try and stand out, if you try and get too much attention on yourself, the others will let you know that that's inappropriate. So you can imagine that two people who are born with the same degree of extroversion, one being raised in the Japanese culture and one being raised in the American culture, the United States culture, may in adulthood display significantly different degrees of extroversion. Even though they were born with the same propensity, the culture may have shaped them into, more or less expression of the trait. So keeping that in mind all through, we know that there probably are traits and that you're probably born with predispositions to act in certain ways, but it's probably a shortcoming of the trait approach to say, all that matters is what you were born with, and it's a lot less important, what feedback the environment has given. And, the behaviorist would say everything is a function of your early experience, the series of rewards and punishments that you've had. Well, that's probably short-sighted also, because you probably were born with some predispositions. So we've got sort of these polar opposite theories, right? We've got behaviorism saying it's all about the environment. We've got trait theory saying it's all about being, innately born. You've got psychoanalytic theory saying, that you have, all humans have the same potential, and then it's a function of how much our environment encourages or discourages certain aspects. But it's definitely not talking about traits as the outcome. It's talking about just healthy functioning as the outcome, or unhealthy functioning. So we really have got just really disparate theories going on, and it's really important for you as a student to just sort of be taking it all in and thinking, which one am I liking better? Which one's explaining my experience better? Because these things can really vary. Humans are clusters of temperaments, those inborn predispositions, traits, those more detailed inborn dispositions, and then skills. The trait and skill approach says that, free will is present, but really that's only when you're consciously acting and really intentionally deciding how to act and stuff like that. Your predisposition, your motives will typically be like what I like to call your knee-jerk reactions, the things that you do without, if you're not really thinking, you'll just do your natural predisposition. If you think about it, then you might be able to modify your behavior, and then you'll display free will. But otherwise, you're just going to sort of react. Common assessment techniques, we've gone through the factor analysis, the self-reports. We have the tests for measuring, I showed you the projective tests for measuring the styles. I talked a little bit about intelligence. We haven't really gotten there yet. They also use document analysis. They do behavioral observation, interviews. I talked about that a little bit when I talked about the development of the 16PF. And then implications for therapy. I mean, the trait theory assumes that you can change your goals and orientations, but probably not your really just basic dispositional natures. Those whatever basic traits we assume you have, whether it's 2 or it's 5 or whatever, it's 16. Those basic sort of predispositions are going to be difficult to overcome consistently. Like anytime you're tired, they'll probably reveal themselves again. Anytime you're overwhelmed, anytime you're not really thinking, maybe you're distracted, you're thinking about something else at the same time, and so you just behave, sort of naturally and without thinking. Those dispositional natures are probably going to reveal themselves again. So the trait approach says that, a person who's in therapy should not be in therapy to attempt to change their basic self. They should be focusing on goals and orientations, and that's it. All right, I thought I'd finish with just a hodgepodge of a bunch of random people I pulled off the internet to illustrate, there's just so much variety, and these are all, I think they're all Americans that I pulled. There's just so much variety in how people are. And so I think there's a lot to be said about the trait theory being probably pretty accurate, because, behaviorism kind of implies that if you share the same environment, you should come out exactly the same as your peer. And that doesn't really happen. Psychoanalytic theory says that, given parents who are perfectly meeting your needs, everybody should come out healthy. And that's not necessarily the case either, right? So all these different variations in how people are probably in part, at least, due to predispositions that we would call traits. So hopefully I made a pretty decent case for the trait theory. This concludes this chapter, and I will see you next in the next chapter. So thanks for listening.